Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Fellows in the Field, our second of three. We are so excited to have you here today. I'm Michelle Deutschman, the Executive Director of the Center, and I'm pleased you could be with us. If you're new to the Center, welcome. The Fellows in the Field are an opportunity for folks like you who are working actually in the field to hear directly from our incredible fellows about their projects and how they can assist you in your day-to-day work. So if you haven't had a chance to see all of the terrific research of our most recent class of fellows, we'll drop that link into the Q&A. And of course, we will feature the amazing toolkit that Brandy and Neil put together. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping things. Questions and answers you can put in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get as many of them as possible. Of course, if you want to enable captioning, click the button at the bottom of your screen that says turn on caption. Before I introduce Drs. Haffner-LeBlanc and Hutchins, I do want to acknowledge what a challenging time it is in the world right now. And I imagine that everyone on a campus has a front row seat for how divisive these political issues are and how they contribute to an unhealthy climate on campus. Today's topic, the new campus speech zone, institutional responses and educational efforts involving social media, couldn't be more relevant in light of the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. We have seen much of the debate playing out on social media, and many institutions are having to thread the needle of how and when to respond to comments that stakeholders make on their personal social media accounts, which is one of the reasons that this webinar is perfectly timed to assist all of us as we navigate these treacherous waters. So without further ado, I want to introduce the authors of this amazing toolkit. I'll start with Dr. Haffner-LeBlanc, who currently serves as Vice President for Student Engagement and Enrollment Services at Old Dominion University. She previously served as the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Campus Life at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and professor in the higher ed program. With over 25 years of experience in higher education, she has served as Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Professor of Higher Education at the University of Mississippi and held multiple administrative roles at Northern Illinois University, Arizona State University, University of Northern Carolina at Wilmington, Baldwin Wallace College, and the University of Akron. Dr. Hutchins currently serves as a professor of educational policy studies and evaluation at the University of Kentucky. He previously served as professor and associate chair in the University of Mississippi School of Education's Department of Higher Ed and as inaugural chair for the Department of Higher Education. He was also an affiliated faculty in the University of Mississippi School of Law. He earned his PhD from the University of Maryland and his JD from the University of Alabama School of Law. His research focuses on legal and policy issues in higher ed, with a key strand of his scholarship centered on free speech and academic freedom. Brandy and Neil, I am so thrilled that you're with us today. I see the two of you as a dynamic duo. And like all superheroes, there's usually an origin story. And so I thought we could start today by having each of you share what drew you to this issue at this juncture in your careers. And Brandy, why don't you kick it off?
All right. Well, good morning to you. Good afternoon. I don't know if I had a glitch there. So good morning to you. Good afternoon to others. And thank you, Michelle, for hosting this and for the center's leadership in this space. So the origin story for me, I guess professionally, I just had been watching this issue, this space really amplify, year after year. And frankly, what I was finding as I was going to conferences and folks were still talking about speech zones on campus, and I was dealing with the speech zone of social media. And so for me, I felt really obligated to try and figure out, how do we get our arms around this? How do we better understand this to help the colleagues I was working with who really were on the front line? So, from where I sit, a lot of the work in this space is often punted to folks in student affairs and to folks in the DEI space. Those folks tend to be non-tenured, non-contract. And so it was challenging for them. And so that for me was, an area where I wanted to be a better advocate and I wanted to better understand the issues. I think a lot of times there was also a mentality of just, student affairs, make it go away or control these students type of thing. And, we don't control students. We have ethics. And so it was really important for me, again, to kind of delve into this more. So when I paired that with like growing mental health concerns, and kind of a lack of sometimes skill sets as students come into college and understanding how to effectively dialogue, there was just a lot here that was really germane to the educational mission, not just as a student affairs professional, but as someone working in an institution of higher education. So aside from it being very draining to my colleagues, and wanting to do something about it, it was really important as an educator to dig in. So I think for me, it was 3 goals: to talk really about social media specifically when it came to the First Amendment. Secondly, to express that we need a whole community approach to this. This isn't just student affairs job or a DEI professional's job on campus, and care for the people that I work for or work with on campus. So that's kind of where it came from. And then I went to my chair at the time in the University of Mississippi and said, we should be thinking about this. Like, we should be digging into this. So that's kind of how I ended up approaching Neil about this particular project.
Thank you. Okay, Neil, now we're going to hear your side of the story.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Michelle, for hosting us today, and to everyone for attending. I think there are some general interests at play that go back a long ways for me. So as an undergraduate, I worked as a reporter and was an editor for my university newspaper. So issues of speech and expression came to the fore there. As someone who also had connections to K-12, a former teacher. And then in law school, I was one of those people who very much enjoyed constitutional law issues, free speech issues. I mean, that some people, might have been maybe found that a little dry or something, but like things like forum and this idea of then what happens to a college or university. As I always like to say, it's interesting in colleges and universities where this magnet for speech and expression, it doesn't tend to necessarily be the same for other governmental agencies. People may get very frustrated with their Department of Motor Vehicles, but we don't necessarily see that as the place where we see lots of protest and speech and expression and other things. So it's this magnet for society, and then also what colleges and universities do. It is interesting. I remember being in graduate school as a PhD student, people would ask my interest, and I would sometimes say speech and expression, and people would kind of turn their head and look a little bit sympathetically. It was before we had really heated up with this new generation of speech and expression on college campuses. So it's something I've been intrigued with intellectually for a long time. But as I've gone forward in my career, I've gotten to see aspects of how this really plays out and the importance. So, for instance, work that I've been able to do as a member of the litigation committee for the American Association of University Professors. And also, you get drawn in or connected to specific incidents, such as at my former institution, we had a professor who tweeted something. This is when it was still called Twitter officially. So tweeted something that caught the attention of a US senator who was very upset. And actually the institution's chancellor, so the leader of the institution, responded. It was really not certain if the institutional leader was responding in an individual capacity or an institutional capacity, but this really unfurled in a way that eventually you had this professor who you might not have agreed with what they said or the way they said it. I think it was constitutionally protected, but you had a chancellor who was really, without consulting their communications team or others, was coming out taking a strong stance. And the next thing you know, this professor was having security on their hall because of the threats and other things. So just with social media, realizing that what can happen in this space can have very deep and serious consequences.
Well, thank you both. And for those of you that are just joining us, you can drop questions into the Q&A. So Brandy, I'm going to start off with you. Now that you have actually spent so much labor and time and effort and energy making this very comprehensive, 40-page toolkit, I would love for you to share with the folks listening, what do you want people to take away from it? Ideally, everyone's going to read every word, but if they didn't, right, what are the key take homes from your perspective?
you know, you had to have one moment where someone didn't unmute themselves. So, you know, Neil and I worked on a book with some other colleagues, Contested Campus. And after that, lots of colleagues reached out and were looking for more information about free speech and specifically trainings. I've even had a colleague recently ask about kind of an out-of-box training because of a legislative mandate in their state. And I think that was kind of, as we thought about this project and as we were working through it, I think what was really important, at least I'll speak for me, but I think Neil shared in this, is that this was not to build trainings. This was to really to create a resource, to create important dialogue on campus so that the whole campus could be a part of educating themselves and shifting really culture on campus. Because a training isn't going to really do what we need to do as far as to create, you know, the understanding and the skill sets to be able to effectively dialogue and engage in that. And so we think, you know, again, as part of my writing, the idea of really creating kind of a culture change with this, where it's not training, but instead truly a learning resource. So a way to hopefully put a document in front of campus leaders for them to start to have a conversation about how do we create, first of all, what is it that how do we interpret this? Where do we stand on this issue? How are we educating not just students? You have to start with your faculty and staff. You have to start with other key community members and make sure everyone understands kind of what the institution's position is. And then how prepared are we to assess when something occurs, what it is really, you know, is there a violation there or not? How are we going to respond? How are we going to support individuals that are impacted by that? So that kind of aftermath of the incident. So really thinking about proactive efforts on your campus. Well, I guess I'll starting with just where do you stand? Fundamentally, where does the institution, how's the institution stand on this issue? What types of actions will they take? What types of statements would they release? And then again, going from there, how do we educate our faculty and staff, other community members that are important to the campus community? And then how do we respond? So for me, it's shifting from just that response need that's out there right now. And I understand that need, but really trying to get all the way upstream and having institutions think about it more broadly, because that's, to me, the big takeaway and where I hope it's a little different.
Do you want to add anything, Neil, or keep going?
No, as usual, I think Brandy covered that very, very wonderfully.
Anyway, if anything, besides learning about social media and speech, it's like an amazing role modeling for partnership. So, you know, I think this is, you know, I'm gonna, like Neil, I love form analysis, and obviously I really love the First Amendment. But I think anytime we talk about expression, it creates an opportunity to review the basics of the First Amendment. And as both of you know, at the core of the center's work is education. So dialogue, debate, viewpoint diversity can only be built if you have a strong educational foundation, which is why I thought we would use a polling question today. So you're going to see a poll that's going to come up. It's true or false. So everyone, you have a 50% chance of getting this right. And no one will know what you answer. Just says true or false. The First Amendment applies to private companies, i.e. social media platforms. And I'm just going to ask if folks can kindly take a minute to fill this out. And then we will we'll move on and do a couple free speech basics, and then we will hear from our legal expert today, from Neil. So I'll give you a moment. And we'll see if this group does better than the group of people who were polled in Freedom Forum's 2023 Where America Stands report. So while we're waiting for the results of that, I also want to just take a minute to remind people that the reason that the First Amendment comes into play, right, is because public universities are an extension of the government, and therefore they are obligated to follow the rules of the First Amendment. Let's just, let's see. Okay, so All right, so false. The First Amendment applies to private companies. All right, I'm super impressed. 70% of folks got the right answer. The answer is false, and 30% said it was true. So the Freedom Forum poll that I mentioned, only 24% of people surveyed knew that the First Amendment does not apply to private workplaces. So when we're talking about the First Amendment, we're talking about the government. And in this case, the government can be federal, state, or local government, and it can be public institutions like libraries and public universities, right? So private universities don't officially have to follow the First Amendment, but most of them do, because it's going to be hard to argue that you're really invested in the mission of higher education if you're not going to allow different kinds of speech. So social media accounts are treated the same way as other physical forums are by the law. The most important thing, I think, and Neil can correct me if he disagrees, is for the purpose of the forum, in this case, the social media account, to be clear so folks understand what rules apply. Right? For instance, let's say a dorm creates a social media account so residents can share things that are happening. If the first 10 people post, and then the 11th person posts something that, say, is considered hateful or offensive, and the person running the social media account says, hey, person 11, I'm taking down your post. They're going to have a lot of difficulty holding that decision up in court, because it's going to seem like the reason they pulled down the post was based on the content of the message. And that is not something that the First Amendment allows. However, if the purpose of the social media account was only to post, it's only for postings by dorm residents about meetings or programs happening in the dorm, when someone posts outside that scope, it can be removed. So, Neil, I want to ask you, because as a lawyer and an educator, how you see Black letter law kind of fitting into this puzzle, especially in a moment when technology moves way faster than the law does and ever likely will.
I think at a basic level, I would phrase it this way, that an understanding of the nuances of First Amendment law related to issues of free speech, and you can have other legal components that come in. So for instance, collective bargaining, there can be rights for those, even in private institutions, is that it is a facet, it is a component of this kind of educational process that Brandy is talking about, but it's not sufficient. In other words, it's incomplete. And I think if we look at some of the earlier generation, when I say that, maybe 10 years ago, when we first, again, on a lot of campuses started having a lot of speech and expression, but also just generally more student activism, one of the first responses would be, at institutional level, might be, look, this is protected by the First Amendment. This is it. And that left a lot of questions unanswered. And so I think that there is a component that though, if you also go in and have conversations around speech and expression, and one wants to ignore or doesn't really take into account the fact that, well, for instance, federal courts, and it could be state courts as well, they don't really take too kindly to being ignored. And so, for instance, they will, if you have someone on your campus who advocates successfully that their speech rights have been violated, including on social media, you can't just ignore if they take that to court and a court says, no, you can't continue to do this. So this is where colleges and universities, we often think of them as a closed system, but they are very much part of a larger society. What I also want to say on the educational stream, though, is that I think there's a way to talk about and examine legal issues in higher education, including around the speech and expression, that it really is educational. It's not talking at students, it's not talking at faculty, it's not talking at staff, but it's talking with them to explore. So for instance, while we're in a current place where courts generally default to being oftentimes protective of speech and expression, including on social media during its most recent term, even the court in relation to social media clarified the standards around threat, which can make it hard to show what's an actual threat that would not be protected under free speech principles. We can also acknowledge this can be contested, that there can be different conceptualizations of what should and shouldn't be protected. And this also extends into concepts such as hate speech. So we often in higher education, student affairs, will use the concept of hate speech. And there'll be a question of, for instance, is, lack of protections for hate speech under the First Amendment. And one of the things that when I work with students or I work with other groups is that this is a concept that is well defined in the literature, but it's not one that courts use. There isn't a category of excluded speech called hate speech under First Amendment doctrine in the way that, for instance, we do have a certain small number of categories of speech that have been excluded. But I'll just sum it up to say, though, that I also think sometimes in communicating on the First Amendment, and this would include students, we talk at students instead of talking with them to really explore, well, what are the logics that say, well, why we should protect free speech? I mean, there are assumptions that we also free speech proponents make, and this is an opportunity for us to really put that under a scholarly or academic microscope as well. And so I think understanding legal principles and legal standards are integral to this process and this conversation, but it's not sufficient alone. They're the psychological harms, the things that can happen as a result of speech and expression, the fact that we can think about there are other countries that have different standards for speech. And I'm not weighing in and saying that the fact that in France that they will put restrictions on individuals being able to use Nazi symbols or anti-Semitic speech or something like that, but that's a different standard. So thinking about the comparing and contrasting from an educational standpoint, that's where I think we want to move our campuses and to think about these bigger issues of how we interact, civility in discourse, but also the harms that can come.
I'm gonna just echo a couple of things you're saying, because I agree. And I think one of the hard parts is that people want a very binary answer. Okay, is it constitutional? Is it not constitutional? I would say that that isn't the hard part of the inquiry. Most of the times it's going to be pretty clear whether or not you're violating the Constitution, and most times you won't be. But the harder question is what Neil was talking about and what Brandy's talking about, which is this holistic conversation, which is whether or not the post gets pulled down or stays up, you're going to have members of your campus population who are going to be very unhappy. And it's all about how do we talk about that? We had two questions, and so I'm just going to answer them because I think one of them says, so to clarify, social media companies are private, but if public entities use them, the public entities still have to abide by free speech laws on the social media platform. Correct. So if the University of California at Irvine decides to have social media use social media accounts, yes, those have to abide by the First Amendment. If you're Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, they get to make their own decisions. And of course, that's a whole other webinar we could have, which is what kinds of standards do we want private companies to use? Do we want them to pull down misinformation? Do we not? But you've summarized it well. And then somebody else just said that they work at UCSF Health, and they joined today to help learn about what they can and cannot post. And so what I would say is that it's less about what you can and can't post and more about what the goal of your social media account is. And that is going to help you determine what comes up and down. But there are some really excellent pages, I should know by heart which pages in the toolkit, that actually explain kind of the framework about how to decide what you want to allow on your social media account. I think one thing I'll just add before I turn back to Brandy is consistency is really, I think, one of the key things is that you're going to create some guidelines for your forum, but then you have to apply them consistently, even though it might be really difficult because it might mean allowing a post to stay up that makes people really uncomfortable. So one of the things that I particularly appreciated about this toolkit is that it did more than address sort of the usual stakeholders who are so important, students, staff, and faculty, but it also speaks to board members and alumni and parents. And I think that's particularly timely now as we're seeing the impact of a lot of external pressures being brought to bear. And I'm wondering, Brandy, if you can talk about why this was important to include and maybe some suggestions for how to engage these sort of unusual, suspects in these conversations.
Sure. Yeah, I did think it was important to kind of challenge campuses to think about this. I think that, first of all, again, you have to really start at that place of when is the institution going to speak? We talk about the institution as a speaker in the learning resource. When they won't speak, why, like, again, I think sharing with folks the why and the rationale of, you know, how you're moving is really, really important. And kind of to the question, like, helps people that are running social media accounts, you know, in departments, some direction and guidance there. But I think also making sure that you're involving your greater community in that, in those discussions, and getting that clarity with them as well. Now, they won't all agree. So like, I think about going to the board, and that can look very different for, you know, one campus to another campus. But, you know, like, one of the strategies, you know, lots of boards will have retreats. But again, I mean, at least bringing that information to the board and talking about it, to say, you know, this is where we stand. Again, they may want to give feedback that has to be negotiated, I'm sure. But having that clarity, even if they don't agree with you, they become a megaphone for your institution when incidents arise. So they may be griping about it, but they're still explaining why you've done what you've done, because they have that information. And I think the same is true with alumni boards. I think the same are true with many parents groups. I think, you know, for families, it's more important for them to understand just what is it my student maybe will encounter on campus, and how can I help talk about it with them from home. It may be a decision point for them in selecting their campus, frankly. And so I think that those are important communities to have this conversation with. Again, it may not always be comfortable or easy, but I think at least it just goes back to that piece of really for the institution, again, probably at more of the senior level, having that discussion of, you know, how is the institution going to move, and then giving that guidance to, you know, academic departments, other campus departments, and helping people understand what that means then in their individual roles on campus.
One of the things I really liked was this idea of parents, and when parents go on tours, that there's a discussion about these kinds of issues, right? I mean, when I went on a college tour, I mean, you literally saw some buildings, and you saw a library, and you saw, you know, a young adult, right, who had memorized a lot of great information about the university. And, you know, I imagine it's different, you know, now. But anything, Neil, you want to add about these sort of, you know, more external folks?
I was just going to add something real quick for you.
Please.
That's okay. I mean, previous institution, you know, working on the enrollment side, and we would have protests, and there would be campus tours, and folks would say, do you want us to shift the tour? And we're like, no, our guides are prepared to talk about that and what that means on our campus. And I think it's important. And again, they, you know, those students kind of tell that through their lens of, you know, like, in that particular campus, it's not an everyday occurrence, but this is important, and this is how it empowers students. And I honestly, in those situations, those students could frame that better than I would have framed that for those families and for those students, because they were talking peer to peer. So sorry, Neil, I didn't mean to jump in there, but.
No, I mean, I think that is spot on. I mean, I think that we have to think about these conversations broadly, and they're the immediate individuals on our campus, but they also do spill over into parents, alums, and others. I think one of the aspects of us pushing this idea of deep conversations and learning on our campuses, and it's something that I see again and again, and we're seeing it right now with a lot of the issues that are playing on our college campuses over what's happening with Israelis and Palestinians and debates. You know, certainly there are devastating things that are happening in another part of the world, but we're having very serious disagreements on our campuses. When people are in the middle of a crisis, as they view it, and they feel that their personhood is under attack, or they feel that something is very serious, as much as I love forum analysis, I have found that is not the time that I can say, well, let's step back and think about the different, like a traditional public forum, then we'll talk about designated public forum. That's where providing education provides the mental capacity, the tools and skills that we are hopefully building communities that are on our campuses, but transcend our campuses to really try to deal with this. I mean, I think that in many ways, college campuses, and this plays out in social media context, we're really at this polarization that we see in our political and social environments. Social media tends to be a lightning rod for this. And these are issues that we've got to work through, I think, at a deep level.
So one of the things that you highlight in the toolkit is not only policies that universities that you think have some policies that are particularly excellent, but you also talk about universities that have guidelines. And, the lawyer in me is very interested in that distinction of like, what does it mean to have, guidelines, and what does it mean to have policies? How would you distinguish, the two?
Yeah, so I've worked a long time at public universities, so I love myself a good policy. And I'm always in meetings saying, so is that a policy? Is that our procedure? Is that our practice? Like throwing around these words because they get thrown around and we aren't precise all the time. And so this was very intentional to really point out that some campuses have, have taken a policy approach. Others have taken really a guideline approach. What I really like about the guidelines is I think it really does, it gets back to that educational piece. So the two I will highlight from the ones that we talk about in the learning resource is the University of Michigan guidelines and then Marymount University. And both, so the University of Michigan one is really, I think, is written more in a student facing approach, but they talk about, first of all, they start with privacy and confidentiality and, thinking through, when you put things out there, how you lose some of that. It talks about the notion of do no harm. It talks about personal responsibility, but then it gets into respecting others, being a valued community member. So it's doing a nice job of really giving someone something to think about before they engage. And really, like I said, trying to take an educational approach to that. The Marymount one, I think, is more kind of faculty staff facing, and I think does in a different way, equally good job of really helping employees think through what does it mean when I'm making these posts. So I do think it's a really important distinction. And again, we provided some campuses there that go out and take a look at their, whether it's policy or guideline. So I guess more to zoom out, of course, the policy being more of that formal statement, I would consider it a little bit almost mandatory, right? You don't want to break the policy. But procedures would be more kind of prescriptive or step by step, and a guideline would be more of a general recommendation, kind of best practices, if you will.
I think I need to write down those 3 definitions because it was super helpful. One of the things, especially coming up now in what we've seen in the recent current events, is a lot of discussion and debate about how leaders of institutions should use their institutional voice, right? And sometimes they use it on social media and sometimes not. But what about the people who aren't necessarily at the very top, who don't have that kind of megaphone or platform or even the decision-making authority? I'm guessing that's a lot of people, like me and others who are attending today. What role can they play? How can they engage in this topic in a meaningful way? Because I think sometimes the coverage makes it seem like the only folks that are really able to engage are the people, that have the largest megaphone. Oh, and also, thank you so much. Melanie just posted the Marymount University guidelines and the Michigan State guidelines, so everyone can click on those.
And also, Michelle, I was going to say on quickly an example of difference between policy and guidance. One of the questions we have is someone is asking, can the speakers provide guidance for moderating comments? In what case is it okay to delete a comment? 2 things. One, that could be under guidelines, but there could be a policy. And this where we talked about black letter law. So for instance, we were joking how much we adore forum analysis, but let's say you're a public institution and social media has created a forum. We'll say it would be called a type of limited forum. That could mean, for instance, that if you've got a forum that's dedicated to the women's softball team, that if comments are on there about political situations or other kinds of things, you may be well within the range of what that forum is about to be able to remove certain kinds of comments. So that would be an example of understanding the nature of that. What we're referring to as black letter law would provide you guidance in the discretion that you have in that area, where guidelines, I think even more broadly, might give you suggestions like things to think through when you're setting up a social media account for your department or your sports team, or how you define it. Because one of the things, and we've seen it with political figures, if you really create a site that's really open for political speech on a forum, social media forum for a college or university, guess what? You're likely to get political speech. And so thinking about the things that you can moderate. But Michelle, back to the issue of thinking about people in their place, I actually want to start foundationally with, that's again, I think, with the educational approach, where it's not a new faculty orientation or a student orientation, week or weekend. It's where I think leadership and others, that we are bringing people together in meaningful ways to think about these kinds of issues in terms of how we're building campus policy. And so that's where I also do think it's very much a two-way street, in that sometimes I see some of the conversations or discussion around free speech, like we'll postulate, well, we just have to explain to the students how this works. Well, there's also a component of, we also need to understand where students and their social media use and how they're thinking about privacy and speech and other things are happening. So how are we providing those spaces on our campus where those conversations are actually happening? But it's not just that leadership is really kind of giving a list of items to cover, or it's in a training, but it's also how I think those who do ultimately set the policy, who do speak for institutions, how they're also understanding and being informed by the community. So in some ways, it's not a simplistic answer, but it's one where I think, Michelle, we've talked about, I think it's UC Irvine this year is really devoting the campus to thinking around these issues. I think James Madison University this year is really devoting its campus to think about issues of speech and expression. And this can extend to social media. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to have happening on our campuses. And what I would say is that's also as we think about the responses. I know that my own institution recently, we've had some issues. These weren't in social media, but there were other things. And there were forums that were also created just for staff and faculty and to process and work through these kinds of issues. So I'll zip it up there, since I'm probably doing a 2-for-1 on an answer, but I think this is also tied into, again, thinking about how that would be an issue of are we responding to and listening to our community as we think about what do we need in terms of educationally and our guidance that we're providing.
No, thank you. I can always listen to you speak. And just to echo it, I think sometimes we trick ourselves up when we think about social media as like it's different. I would think of it just kind of like the quad, right? So this idea that if you have the quad, which is kind of thought of as a pretty traditional public forum, right? It's a designated forum, it gets opened up, right? So if Brandy comes on and Brandy, let's just say, her message is super well liked by students, everybody really resonates, they really like when she's on campus. And so sometimes when she violates, let's say, the amplified speech policy, she plays loud music, even though she's not allowed. Nobody says anything to her because they like her message, right? Administrators are like, oh, we'll give Brandy a pass. But Neil comes and he's a little more controversial, right? He's kind of brings a rowdier crowd and some people don't like his ideas. And he's also playing really loud music. But this time the students say, we don't like Neil's message. And the administrator goes over to Neil and says, hey, can you stop with the music? Right? That's a problem because you're treating messages, different speakers differently because of the message, right? Same thing with chalking. If you want to have a chalking policy and say, hey, this area is where you can chalk. Well, it's all fine and good when people write, I love this university. But when someone writes something awful about a faculty member or a class, you're going to have to leave it up, right? So that's the same idea on social media. I see another question in the queue, but before we get to that, I want to just add one thing to say that one of the things I love about the way you guys talk about this is that we're not blaming kids today, because I think that is really misguided. And I also just want to share that, like, oftentimes it's staff, administrators, and faculty who actually don't understand the rules or don't understand, social media. So, a couple of good questions about engaging in conversations. So one of them has to do with this idea of sort of chilling speech and how sometimes the responses to what happens on social media can be tough consequences, right? For instance, we have seen that recently some folks, and this is different because their private companies lost their jobs based on some statements that they made about the Israel-Hamas war. And so how do you have these conversations when people might be afraid of being chilled? I think we all know that social shaming by peers is something that happens, and that social media can be used as a weapon in terms of cancellation. And so I don't know if either of you have any thoughts about how we can have these tough conversations in this sort of environment where there isn't a lot of room for repair.
Neil, you want to start? Or you want me to start?
Take it away, Dr. Hatner-Levang.
I think, I mean, so I think there's a time, I mean, I do think that sometimes, like right now, I mean, there's like, we've talked about, there's so much happening on campuses, and this is probably not the time to have a First Amendment conversation. I think this is a time to have a humanity conversation, right? And so I think, when I think about that question, I think it is about, and again, I go back to what we put in the learning resource guide. How are we weaving this into the work we're typically doing? So I talked about, admissions previously, or, even in, and again, I'm thinking about student affairs. I should be thinking about other like classroom settings. Like, how are you, integrating some of these things? How are you creating debate in a classroom in a way where you're managing it, but you're allowing students to practice the skill set of, listening to one another and responding, with good information, being respectful to one another and doing that in a productive way. So like, again, I to keep going back, but it's really about this kind of culture change and trying to really encourage that it's not always a First Amendment conversation, or there doesn't have to be an incident for us to start talking about this again, but instead, how are we building these skills in all of us? And I do think that, I get frustrated when we blame the students, because, our students have grown up in a society that has been increasingly divisive. They don't have good role models that they can look to. And so I think the adults in the room need to look in the mirror a little bit more closely and think about, how am I setting the stage and allowing that educational opportunity to occur, whether it's in the classroom, out of the classroom. I was talking to our new director of conduct the other day, and he was saying that they've done a lot of Zoom related conduct conversations still, and he is trying to move away from that and get students to come back in the office, sit across the table. And he said, half of our engagement anymore is teaching the students how to really engage and talk productively about their disagreement versus, really the conduct violation, right? Like they just want them to walk out of there and understand how to address each other when there's a disagreement. And that's really important learning. And that's really important skill building that folks are having to do on campus. And it also kind of responds to, how do people do this work if they're not a leader of an institution and being able to write the policy? They can do this work every day, but it may not feel the same. But it actually, I think, will go a lot further, right? If there's more people on campus doing that sort of truly educational work and skill building work. But it's got to start. You got to have that skill yourself to begin with. And there's a lot of adults on campus, and I again say that in air quotes, that are struggling with that.
Yeah, I agree. It's like anything that you have to build a muscle, right? And we do that with, I've said this before on webinars, we do that with foreign languages and with math and with technology skills, but we don't necessarily do it with dialogue and conversation. And I think also, and I don't know how either of you feel about this, but this idea, sometimes I don't like the term free speech. One, because there's a huge huge cost to be borne, right, by the fact that a lot of ugly speech is allowed. But also, I worry that the word free might indicate a lack of consequences. And I'm not weighing in on what is or is not an appropriate consequence. But I do think that there is this element of education at a base level, which is that if you're going to use your voice and you're going to use your platform, whether it's as a faculty member or as a student leader, that you do have to be ready for some consequences to your speech. You know, and in an ideal world, I would love for our society to be less like punitive in terms of like punitive sanctions, punitive responses. But I do think there's that piece of this, that just because you have the right to say something, one, doesn't mean you should. And two, you can't use your free speech and then turn around and say, well, now you're chilling. Your response to my free speech is an argument that you're chilling me. So it's hard, you know. I don't know, Neil, if you have any thoughts on either of these things.
No, I think both of those are very illuminating. I think just a couple of points is, so earlier we were talking about leadership and how institutions respond. I also think there's an importance of modeling this consistency in responses. So Michelle, you're talking about, because it's one individual who may be powerful or something like that, then the institution still has to try to be measured in how it deals with an incident versus if a complaint is coming from someone else. And so I think that institutions need to walk, you know, they need to live up to their commitments as well. And they model that for the community. And sometimes that's really, really hard, but I think that that's important. I think students are very good at detecting hypocrisy. And so I also think that even bleeds over. One of the things that I see happening in social media and free speech realm is institutions are great at crafting mission statements and creeds and other things that go beyond just speech and expression. And so if you want to sell students on speech and expression, you also better be ready, I think, for many students to also explain how these other commitments that they see as very valuable too are also being modeled and being upheld by the institution. I also think in that educational point that you're making is that, yeah, I think we need to hopefully get people to think about things before they engage in speech and expression, including and perhaps especially on social media. I'll give a really quick example. A couple of years ago, I worked with a student on a dissertation. It involved free speech and expression. Publicly available documents, things that were in court cases or in newspaper writings. So one of the things involved a student who claimed that they were discriminated against in an educational setting because of their views, which I think would probably be described as racist. Well, after the student's dissertation was made available, the student who was mentioned in the dissertation contacted the academic unit and said, I want the dissertation taken down. And this was a case of, well, just like you had your First Amendment rights, this is an academic study, and these are things that you wanted to go to court and defend your right to do this, and you wanted to defend your right in the first instance. So you do have to be willing to live and respond. But I'll also say that means, though, and it's something we talked about in the learning resource, there's also a role of institutions, how people can be targeted. And this can often happen to women, and this can happen to our students, faculty, and staff of color. And so we see this again and again where there's this kind of piling on. So this is where it's nuanced. There are consequences, but we also, and again, we address it in the learning resource. How are you going to support people when they're actually modeling and engaged in the kind of speech and expression that we would say is protected, and it's in their can't even sometimes be in their official capacities? When they're targeted, how are we going to marshal those resources to, and it sometimes can even be physical protection. And so I think that's the other point of that responsibility is, how do the responsibility we have to members of our community when social media can also be utilized and well, essentially weaponized in a way, and sometimes quite literally.
I'm really happy that you mentioned that. I feel like I was almost going to make it to the end of this webinar. I got so interested and excited about the legal piece that we forgot to talk about, kind of the harassment and targeting. And I do want to mention a couple resources that hopefully can be dropped in. One of our former fellows, now a senior fellow, Nina Flores, worked on this exact issue. She created workshops for universities to use in talking about how to respond when faculty especially are targeted. She's also continuing this work in her senior fellowship. And then I'm sure there's many universities that have this, but UCI actually put together some guidelines, both for staff and faculty, of things that you can do, even just as basic as like, who are the people that you should reach out to, and what are some of the basic things that you can do. So hopefully those will get posted in. And I kind of can't believe it, but we're almost at the end of our time. So what I want to do kind of as a kind of wrap up is, and I know this is a big question because it's like, what are the biggest social media challenges? It's like, there's so many, but kind of looking ahead, maybe especially as we all see on the horizon, upcoming year of presidential, campaigning and election, what are some of the things you think that, folks on the ground should be thinking about and starting to prepare for? And I'll let you decide who gets to go first.
I'll go first. Well, I mean, it builds on what we're just talking about. So I would say, I think at the end of this whole project, it really isn't, it started with thinking about social media. It really uplanded it in the space of it's no different. And I would say, when I think about the future, it's less, I mean, there is a social media problem or challenge, I guess, that exists, but it's a humanity problem. Like, that's the challenge for me, is how do we build, and again, I think about my work with students, how do we build a more, a group of students, how do we build a society that's more willing to listen, more willing to have a little empathy, extend a little grace, certainly, focusing, I think institutions thinking about, how as we move into the election, that we are going to see more of this on social media, we'll see more of it on our campuses, and how are we going to navigate that and certainly support those individuals that will be impacted by these incidents. I think that's very important. And you mentioned some great resources. And I think in our learning resource, we talk about incident response teams as well. So that's kind of another nugget there. But for me, it's just, I think we're just going to see more and more polarization, sadly. I wish that isn't the case, but I think that's what we need to prepare for. And I just, I feel like we've got to really focus on how do we build community in a really targeted way, so that we can all disagree on things, but how do we do that and not tear each other apart in the process? That's what keeps me up at night.
Right, Neil.
So I say ditto because I think that really captures important things. I also think about, because these issues around polarization and speech and expression, they are still very much with us. We're in an impasse on certain issues, and these extend to social media. So in addition, as we think about the learning resource in our immediate campus communities, colleges and universities are designed as places to answer very hard questions. And so really, I think, make that an emphasis, but also we have these incredible experts to think about. For instance, we know on social media issues of bots and misinformation and disinformation, and thinking about those spaces to where we really are harnessing our institutions to not only on our own campuses to think about this, but really as a society, think about how we can adhere to commitments to free speech and expression. But also we have to think about a whole host of consequences that can happen when things go awry. And as Brandy was just saying, how do we find ways to recognize and respect the humanity in one another instead of these disembodied accounts that we can kind of attack and go after? And so I think that's where colleges and universities are special places to try to help us figure that out. But it's definitely a work in progress, and it won't be simplistic. I think we have a ways to go.
Well, it's a really nice way to wrap things up, and kind of hopeful that we can continue to work for, the betterment of humanity. And I really appreciate both of your taking the time to really dive in to this really important resource. And I also want to spend just a second encouraging folks to register for our next and final Fellows in the Field workshop, which is going to take place right after Thanksgiving, with our former senior fellow, Beth Niehaus, on what students can teach us about free speech and inclusion. It's complicated. And I think that's always kind of a hashtag for the issues that all of us are dealing with. And the link to register will be dropped into the chat. If you didn't get a chance to join us for our last Fellows in the Field, you can find that recording of the event on our website. And please check out our most recent episode of the Speech Matters podcast featuring ACLU's Director of the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, Ben Weisner. Ben joined us to discuss how the First Amendment and freedom of speech are being used as a defense in some of the Trump indictments and what impact that is having on how Americans think about expression. So I want to again thank Brandy and Neil, thank all of you for joining us, and just encourage everyone to be well. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon.